This has got to be the best live-action remake I've ever seen. Which is not all that impressive when you really think about it. I might as well have said it was the shiniest turd I've ever seen. What's up, Solo Cups? My name is Jon Solo, and today I'm reviewing a live-action remake of a beloved animated film that tells the heartwarming story of a social outcast befriending a misunderstood creature that society fears but ultimately learns to love after they save the day. How to Train Your Dragon, of course. See, you might have thought I was gonna say Lilo and Stitch with how I was setting that up. But nah, these movies just have a strange amount in common. I mean, not only are their stories extremely similar, with their remakes adding almost nothing meaningful to said stories, their original versions were written and directed by the same guys, DeBlois and Chris Sanders, both of whom were also involved in their remakes, though in very different capacities. Now I hope you're feeling thirsty, because I'm ready to spill some tea. And now I hate myself for using that phrase. One of the main points of criticism that I've seen for the How to Train Your Dragon remake is that its director and writer, DeBlois, is a hypocrite. You see, years ago, your boy Dean made a statement where he shat all over Disney for their live-action remakes. He called them lazy, disappointing, and missed opportunities to put out something original. Granted, he phrased it in a way that was actually poised and diplomatic, but if I led with that, you wouldn't have been as interested. So if anyone else asks, he shat all over them. Anyway, I should mention that I completely agree with Dino, and I'm willing to bet that you do too. I mean, there's gotta be someone out there who prefers the new Little Mermaid to the old one, but I would say they're a rare breed, even among Disney adults. The point is, he said himself that live-action remakes of animated movies were generally lesser films and an insult to the art of animation. So how can he justify making one himself?
You're not an intellectual. You're a fake and a fraud.
Well, here's the thing. From what I gathered after reading numerous interviews with him and watching several more, he didn't have a lot of choice. Universal Studios was going to make this movie whether he was involved or not. After all, the new Epic Universe Park has its own Isle of Berk, and they need to sell tickets, damn it. With this in mind, Dean went on the record to say that he realized if he didn't direct it, then someone else was going to, and he didn't want to see someone else's version of it because he's too protective of the world and its characters. I would imagine that is a tough position to be in. He made a nearly flawless, timeless adventure film that you could honestly watch on mute just to admire the visuals, and it wouldn't even hinder your understanding of the story. But then someone wants to remake it in an art style that was never considered during its creation. Would you give someone else the go-ahead to reshape your world as they saw fit and risk tarnishing the legacy of your work? Do you even agree that remakes affect the original's legacy? Let me know in a comment. The point is, I want to give Dean some credit. He knew full well how hypocritical he was going to look by taking the lead on this project, but he says he did it for the fans, to honor the story they all know and love, and ensure it was made with integrity. I almost want to give Universal credit too, because it sounds like they trusted Dean's vision 1000% and didn't put up any creative roadblocks. When the company's president, Peter Kramer, first floated the idea to Dean, he basically described the best case scenario for a remake. We want that story, but bring every embellishment you can to it. Let's explore the mythology, deepen the characters, and make it more mature. Let's lean into the action and make it more visceral and immersive. Hey, when you put it like that, it doesn't sound half bad to me. Of course, there's also a certain risk in that. I feel like with animated movies in particular, they trim all the fat they can, because animation is an expensive and time-consuming process, so the story has got to be told in an almost streamlined way. And by the end, they have a really good sense for what's necessary for the story, what enhances it, what can be done more effectively, and what's ultimately a waste of time, leading to scenes being cut out, combined, or completely rewritten.
It's funny because we were under such pressure to finish the film, down to counting the shots, the effect shots that we had in the film, and having to limit them. Like, do we really need an explosion here? Does this really have to catch fire? You know, do we need these clouds? And it was really kind of down to it. Like, were we going to be able to finish the movie?
Sure, the corporate suits might want to expand on the world, but the filmmakers already told the most effective story possible. So how can they expand on a story like How to Train Your Dragons in a way that audiences will appreciate, without leaning on the lore established by the sequels? I don't want to get into spoilers just yet, but Dean DeBlois seems to think they pulled it off. He says, "This version, in my opinion, retains the best aspects of the original while adding good, subtle, and significant enhancements. Those are some lofty promises, and personally, I don't think they delivered." But before I explain why, let me tell you about today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the go-to service I recommend to anyone who needs their own website but doesn't know where to start. That's because they're the most approachable and most affordable. They could not make the process easier if they tried. They supply you with dozens of award-winning website templates so you don't have to worry about starting from square one, and each template can then be tailored to your specific needs. Like, I personally use messeduporigins.com as a jumping off point for our community members to find links to playlists, my merch store, and even check out fan art. But you can actually sell goods through your website if you want to. You could create portfolios to show off your artwork, start a blog to share your thoughts, and it's all done with their super smooth Fluid engine, which allows you to drag and drop assets where you want them. Best of all, though, is that you can try Squarespace totally free just by clicking the link in the description or heading to squarespace.com/Jon Solo. Then, when you realize you love it, use code Jon Solo to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Alright, so my review of the live action How to Train Your Dragon is essentially a review of the animated one, because they made almost no changes to the story. In the immortal words of Mike Goldberg, they are virtually identical. And hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But if it wasn't broke, why did they make a new one? I'll talk more about that later, but in the meantime, here's a hint.
We're in the money.
So How to Train Your Dragon follows a teenage Viking named Hiccup whose society seems to exist solely for the purpose of killing dragons. But one day, after Hiccup decides to spare the life of a dragon he had at his mercy, he learns these creatures are more complicated than his fellow Vikings believed. He bonds with the dragon, which he names Toothless, and becomes its rider, an incredible feat that had never been done before, to their knowledge. But Hiccup's dad, the village chief, and the old guard can't support a kinship with any dragon, knowing how the beasts have terrorized them for centuries. That is when the other shoe drops, and this is your first and only warning before I spoil the movie's finale. It turns out the dragons all serve an alpha and only steal the Vikings' livestock so they have something to sacrifice in place of themselves. Hiccup's dad leads the Vikings in a raid against the alpha, only for them to realize almost immediately that they bit off more than they can chew. So it falls on Hiccup, his friends, and their new dragon mounts to come to the rescue. Ultimately, it's Hiccup and Toothless who take down the big Mama Jama, and the effort nearly kills them, but Hiccup does survive. Well, most of him. He's also hyped to discover that his society is way better off now and have fully integrated dragons into their way of life, which in theory should entail a lot of pillaging, but the movie never addresses that. So there is a lot to love about How to Train Your Dragon. Both versions. I've obviously got to talk about it from a messed up origins angle because I love how the movie's plot is basically a meta commentary on the evolution of how dragons were perceived by denizens of the Western world. For millennia, dragons and serpents were demonized by Westerners. Literally. Going as far back as Tiamat and the Mesopotamians, they were thought of as supremely powerful monsters with an insatiable hunger for chaos, and Hiccup's village sees them the same way. But Hiccup, then learning that dragons are misunderstood and actually make better allies than enemies, reflects how the general public's view of dragons changed with the publication of certain stories. Specifically, Kenneth Graham's The Reluctant Dragon from 1898 and Anne McCaffrey's Caffrey's Dragon Riders of Pern series from 1967, which, as far as I know, was the first time that humans were ever depicted riding directly on the backs of dragons. With this in mind, the story follows what I've nicknamed the Pet Monster Archetype, also seen in Lilo and Stitch, The Iron Giant, even E.T. to a lesser extent. Stories like I described in the intro: the social outcast makes friends with a misunderstood foreign invader, that invader saves the day, and everyone learns a valuable lesson.
I just love those sorts of stories where there is a coming together of these two very disparate, a boy and a beast, that for a while have such a deep and meaningful impact on one another's lives that even though they may go their separate ways at the end of this story, they are forever changed.
I've also always been a sucker for a good father-son story, or really any parent-child story. Seeing Hiccup and Stoic struggle to understand each other reminded me a bit of me and my own dad, and them coming to terms with those differences in the end almost brought a tear to my eye. But I didn't cry, okay?
There were tears that ran down my face, but I did not cry.
I mean, that's crying.
I would disagree.
Toothless is also friggin' adorable, and I read that his mannerisms were inspired by cats, dogs, and horses. So a lot of pet owners are gonna project their own best boys and goodest girls onto him, which may not have been intended by the animators, but is a brilliant bonus. Every artist involved in both versions of the movie deserve credit though. I definitely think the original visuals are way more engaging and vibrant, and the animation is smoother than what we got in the new one, especially during the flying sequences, but the VFX artists crushed the redesigns of the dragons when reworking them for the new style, which could have been really easy to mess up. Now you might be thinking, wow, the new version really does sound like the exact same story as the original. So what were the significant enhancements that Dean was hyping up? I wish I could tell you. I mean, I can point out a couple of changes they made, but I wouldn't call them enhancements. For one, the Isle of Berk is now a lot more diverse, with a range of races populating it instead of exclusively Nordics. Personally, I think changes like this are superficial and completely unnecessary, especially when characters' visual designs are long established, but this movie at least gives a canon explanation for it, and I think it's a lot better than what we got in the new Snow White. Basically, in the live-action version, the Isle of Berk is a conglomeration of societies that were all terrorized by dragons and came together to better defend themselves. And supposedly, this change wasn't only made to explain the new colorful cast. Dean mentioned that the original movie never explained why the Vikings chose to live on an island that was constantly getting attacked. But now we know that Berk is basically a home base for all these countries' dragon slayers. Now, I never personally wondered why they chose to stay, but I'm sure that question has been raised in the movie's fandom, so at least they have an answer now. The other significant enhancement that I saw Dean mentioned was the motivations for the character of Astrid. Again, I might just be a simpleton, and maybe I hadn't thought about the movie deep enough yet, but I didn't think that she needed any motivation beyond being the best dragon slayer. It seemed like the rest of the kids in the class only cared about being skilled enough to not get killed, while Astrid really pushed her mental and physical abilities. That's why she was so frustrated when Hiccup started dominating every training session. She had put in a ton of work, and he was complete trash until he suddenly wasn't. What was that about? For the new version, they gave Astrid the additional aspiration of becoming village chief, so her siding with Hiccup during his dispute with Stoic put her at risk of losing the current chief's respect and the possibility of that happening. It's not a change I have a problem with, and I think it's good that there's added stakes for her big moment as well. It does feel a little forced and ultimately inconsequential, but if I haven't mentioned it yet, I have not seen the animated sequel, so this new character trait could be in line with what happens to her character later on. I have no idea. They also put more emphasis on Hiccup being a Nepo baby, and his classmates say the only reason he hasn't been exiled from their settlement is because his dad is the chief. There's a scene where Astrid gets real in his face about it, telling him how she came from nothing and that he's been handed everything his whole life, which I couldn't help but laugh at, knowing that Nico Parker is a bit of a Nepo baby herself.
It's Hollywood, baby.
As for the actor who plays Hiccup, Mason Thames, I think he did a superb job recreating Jay Baruchel's performance from the original. Unfortunately for me, I didn't really like Jay Baruchel's performance in the original. I don't mean to be a hater, it's nothing against Jay personally.
It's not so much what you look like, it's what's inside that he can't stand.
I think I'm in the minority with this stance, but I gotta be honest. I just get bummed out whenever I see this guy or hear his voice. Like, as soon as I know he's in a movie I'm watching, I just want to turn it off.
Thank you for summing that up.
Similarities with Jay aside, I think Mason brought just the right amount of wimpy, beta, oddball energy while still making me believe that he could achieve something as badass as training a dragon. I also have to point out that one of my first thoughts while watching this movie was how animated Mason's movements were. He was bouncing around all wild and loose from the opening scene, and I thought, wow, this dude actually looks like a cartoon. Welp, I did some research and learned that as a kid, Mason spent 4 years touring internationally as a ballet dancer. So now those light and springy movements of his make sense. Anyway, I think Mason was a great choice for Hiccup, especially if the claim that he grew up loving the original movie is true. And Gerard Butler reprising his role as Hiccup's dad for the live-action portrayal was an awesome surprise that I'm glad I didn't know about in advance. But here is my problem. None of the enhancements to this movie make it better than the original. And I realize that Dean framing them as enhancements is just his way of coping with the fact that the studio was going to remake his masterpiece whether he wanted them to or not, but still, that is what the director called them. And to those commenting that comparisons to the original are unfair and that I should judge the movie independently, I hear ya, and when I do that, I can honestly recommend it as a family-friendly fantasy adventure. But comparisons to the original are inescapable when the live-action adaptation is nearly a shot-for-shot remake. Their intention may have been to preserve the original's integrity, but when you look at this movie's title, there's no remake or live-action version written anywhere near it. It's supposed to stand on its own. And while I definitely think it does that better than every live-action adaptation Disney's put out in the past decade, it still feels like a missed opportunity to have done something more interesting, which is what Dean himself has said about other live-action remakes. So while I would never say this is a bad movie, I do think the most interesting thing it has going for it is the simple fact that they didn't totally botch it. When that guy from Universal pitched Dean on the remake, he supposedly said they wanted to explore the mythology. Well, there's less of it in this version than the animated one.
Parents believe a hideous name will frighten off gnomes and trolls.
They wanted to deepen the characters, but only managed it with one who didn't need it. He said to make it more mature, but they only achieved that in the sense that the PG-rated violence now looks more realistic than artistic. I'm really grateful that we got one live-action movie that was led by people who actually cared about the story and characters, and I'm not surprised that it satisfied the majority of moviegoers. But I also don't think we should reward this kind of filmmaking, because besides my misplaced hatred of Jay Baruchel, I've got no reason to watch the remake over the original. The original has a more engaging art style, additional scenes, and most importantly, this is how the creator intended the story to be seen when it was created. The disparity in quality isn't even close to where it is with Disney's remakes, but it is still there, and I think that most people would agree that while this remake was good, great even, they'd rather watch the original. Meaning that once the initial intrigue around this live-action experiment has died down, no one is going to talk about it. It'll be a footnote in... Or it's going to make $1 billion just like the Lilo and Stitch remake did, so nothing I say matters anyway. I think that's the part that I am most depressed about. Like, as adequate and harmless as the new How to Train Your Dragon is, all that really matters is how much money it's generating. This movie cost $150 million, which is actually $60 million less than the animated version if you adjust for inflation, and it's raked in $500 million worldwide in just under a month. Then factor in the renewed interest in the How to Train Your Dragon brand, ticket sales at the park, licenses for new merchandise, and this was a genius idea by Universal. It's hard to blame the suits at these studios for prioritizing regurgitated nostalgia bait when audiences are so eager to reward them for it. When you look at all the live-action adaptations Disney has made over the years, almost all of them have squeaked out a profit. Rumor had it that they were rethinking their whole slate of remakes after Snow White was a flop, but the insane success of Lilo and Stitch has probably erased that from memory. I would argue that Disney's legacy matters the most out of any of these studios though, and that squeaking out profits on barely passable films the studio's founder would be embarrassed by is not how you want to add to it. Fortunately, it seems like Universal has learned from their competitors' mistakes, and while How to Train Your Dragon fails to do anything new or exciting with its story, it is a breath of fresh air for the live-action genre. But at risk of repeating myself, all that means is it's the best of the worst. The shiniest of the turds. At least those are my thoughts, but I want to know how others feel, so if you got something to share, comment it down below. I'd be especially curious to hear from people who never saw the original version or felt like this one was better in some way. Remember to sacrifice those like and subscribe buttons to support the channel and get more content like this in your sub box every Thursday. Until next time, my name is Jon Solo, and remember, Jon shot first.